Hey guys, I'm going to talk about Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And I'm going to explain why I find myself agreeing more with Sam Harris, um, especially around topics like it could be uh, racism in our society, or the white privilege, the religion, and even the nature of truth. Now, for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to ignore both far left and far right because, in my opinion, they're one and the same. Uh, they might sound different, but the driving factor or the force that drives them is basically the intolerance, lack of respect for reality, lack of respect for facts. So I'm not interested in because I find both of them equally kind of repulsive because it's very hard to reason with those guys. Take for example far left, right? I mean, they find sexism and the racism and xenophobia, Islamophobia in every single thing. I mean, it's on the other hand, the far right thinks that those things don't exist at all. That so that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to ignore them for the sake of this discussion. All right, let's get to this. So the first thing I want to talk about is the nature of truth. Where as you probably know, there was this infamous fight between Sam Harris. I mean, I shouldn't say fight because Sam Harris had a podcast where he had Jordan Peterson as a guest, and they got into this. They were planning to discuss so many other topics, but they got stuck on this nature of truth. And it went on and on and on, and I think that's it's a quite I'm not going to rehash the whole thing because it runs for about an hour or two, so I recommend you go and listen to that if you haven't already done it. But again, that's one good example where I thought Sam Harris was very strong and very logical and very objective, whereas Jordan Peterson, in my opinion, he was playing games with words. When it comes to nature of truth, he was bringing this concept of survivability and the moral truth, and how moral truth is at the top, overriding scientific truth and scientific facts, etc., etc. Right. So this is where I just don't agree with Jordan Peterson, because it doesn't matter whether whether there is a moral truth or not. I mean, who decides what is moral or not, right? So then does it mean that there was no truth before human beings arrived on this planet? I mean, that doesn't make sense, because if I ask you, uh, is it true that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? Uh, I mean, the answer has to be true. That is true, right? So are you saying that that truth didn't exist before human beings arrived on this planet? Or if there are no human beings, does it mean that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? That truth doesn't exist. So, I mean, that's where I find it kind of. That's exactly where I find Sam Harris very powerful and very articulate and very logical, whereas Jordan Peterson, in my opinion, I think either he's playing game with words, or by bringing that moral truth thing, I think he's trying to sneak in religion through the back door. Again, that's just my hunch, but I could be wrong here again. Now that's a good segue to the topic of religion, right? So that's another place where I strongly disagree with Jordan Peterson, because again, I was listening to one of the recent podcasts where he had this conversation with Matt Dillahunty, where they talk about atheism and the religion and this and that and all the stuff. And again, Matt Dillahunty was very, very articulate, very logical, whereas the Jordan Peterson was, I quite honestly found him very annoying, because one of the things I appreciate about Jordan Peterson, unlike other people, is like he's very respectful, and he doesn't engage in one of those one line or punch lines kind of stuff. But that's precisely what he was doing with Matt Dillahunty, because every time Matt said something and the Jordan Peterson's comeback line is like you think you're an atheist but you're not. That's I found it like a very shallow argument. I think and then he goes on to say how, how if you're an atheist, you don't have any morals. You would throw people off the stage, or like, in fact, in one of the examples, I think during the Q&A, question and answer session, somebody asks him, and then the answer Jordan Peterson gives is he brings up a reference to one of the, I guess, fictional, I don't know, a book where a character who doesn't believe in God ends up killing people, or carrying out a perfect murder, because he doesn't. There are no moral values to hold him back from committing a crime. I mean, to me, that's like, this is the this is the same old argument that, if you don't believe in God, then you are like, you're a horrible human being, right? That's simply not true. And this is again where Sam Harris does a fantastic job of, again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is another area where I strongly agree with Sam Harris, and I find Jordan Peterson to be a kind of a religious person, but he kind of uses this a different language to make his point. But at the end of the day, he believes in the same stuff that some strong religious people believe in. Finally, the question of racism and white privilege in our society. Now, to be fair to Jordan Peterson, he does acknowledge it. He doesn't deny it, right? But I think where I find myself disagreeing with him is when he starts kind of distancing himself, or backpedaling, or kind of start talking as if like it's not a big deal, or like, oh, his grandparents had a rough life, and where was their white privilege, kind of stuff, right? In fact, it's one of the recent TV interviews he brought up his, I think it's a grandma or somebody, and then who lived in a little small house in a wooden cabin or something, and where they had like a very rough life, and they were poor, and they had to work hard. I think this is where he misses a point. I mean, the white privilege doesn't mean that every white family is super rich. Okay, that's not what it means. What it means is that little advantage that white people feel at workplace, or in a local shopping center, or in a neighborhood when you buy a house, or in an apartment complex, or under the school. That's what it means, right? So I'm sure his grandparents were poor, and they had a rough life, like many, maybe millions of other people had. But now compare that to another poor black family at the same time period, who didn't have the option to go and buy a house, or move into a certain neighborhood, or couldn't send their kid to a particular school, or ride a bus without having to worry about somebody yelling at them saying, "Why are you here? Go back to the backside of." So those are the little things that define, or rather, that's what we talk about when we say, like, the white privilege, right? The same thing is true with the racism. Nobody is arguing that there is an institutionalized racism today, right? We have come a long way, and things are far better, right? But it doesn't mean that there is no racism. That there are still people with racial bias, racial mindset, racial preference. So that it shows up in their action. Again, it doesn't. It's not like people will throw you out of the bus, or it doesn't mean that people will tell you to your face that you're not hired because of your race, right? In other words, these experiences are not as dramatic as in like during the Jim Crow days, or the segregation days, or apartheid, in South Africa kind of system, right? Because that was more dramatic, that was more powerful, that was in your face. Whereas today's racism is not an institutionalized racism. It's a mild form of racism. It's like this little comments that you hear. It's this little opportunities that you miss out. It is like the people treating you a little different from the other guy just because of your skin color, or just because of your ethnicity, right? It's like, did you get the job or not? Or during the hiring process, or you're trying to move into an apartment, the kind of answer you get from apartment manager, right? So that's what defines this whole experience. And this is where I don't feel like Jordan Peterson comes out very strongly and acknowledges it. He does acknowledge it, but then he quickly moves on to say, like, oh, well, it happened, during my grandparents' generations or my parents' generation. Why should I be held responsible? Kind of, line of thinking. To me, that's somewhat. Um, I know he's kind of sometimes plays the devil's advocate, and like he's sometimes he seems to focus more on the far left and their crazy argument than sometimes being very objective and look at the whole, strike a balance, right? But my fear is that there could be some far right guys like alt-right and other folks who all of a sudden find a new kind of philosopher here who argues in there, kind of gives them these talking points, and then suddenly they find themselves, like, encouraged to continue down the path of, like, no, there is no such thing called the racism. There's no such thing called white privilege because I don't feel it. See, that's another thing about white privilege, right? If you're a white person, you won't even realize what white privilege is because you think your experience is normal. I mean, again, I can't blame you for that because it's a very natural process where, natural experience, right? So it's not like somebody, as soon as you walk into a store, somebody says, "Oh, come on in, I'll give you 20% discount." No, that's not white privilege. White, as I said, it's the lack of natural experience that people of color face that a white person doesn't have to go through. Okay, that's the white privilege. Anyway, friends, those are my quick thoughts on Jordan Peterson. And that's why I kind of disagree with him on these areas like the nature of truth or the race and the white privilege thing or the question of religion. This is where I find myself agreeing more and more with Sam Harris because I find him very logical, very articulate, and also he's very on the spot. He comes across as not a closed-minded guy, rather somebody who's seeking truth. He's very open-minded about it. If you can prove him wrong, or if you show him enough evidence, or if you show him enough data of the contrary, I think he would be very open-minded, and he would acknowledge his and then he would change his opinion. But I don't see that kind of open-mindedness in Jordan Peterson, especially around the question of moral values and the religion and the race. Okay, so that's where I disagree with him, and that's where I feel like Sam Harris is right and Jordan Peterson is wrong.